If you think you know what happens behind the bars of New York City's most notorious jail, this story will change your mind. On the morning of June 7, 2019, correctional officers at Rikers Island moved through their usual rounds. The air was heavy, humid, thick with the smell of disinfectant and steel. The noise, the shouting, the clanging of doors, the endless hum of tension, was part of the island's rhythm. But that morning, one cell in the women's housing unit was too quiet. Too still. Inside that cell was Layleen Polanco, a 27-year-old transgender woman, performer, and member of New York's vibrant ballroom community. She was known outside Rikers as fierce, bright, and full of life. Inside, she was another inmate waiting for her day in court. Officers had checked on her before. She was in solitary confinement, punitive segregation, as the paperwork called it. 30 days alone for a minor scuffle with another detainee. The punishment was routine. What wasn't routine was what they found when they unlocked her door. Layleen lay motionless on the bed, the small fan in her cell still spinning. Her radio was on, murmuring a pop song beneath the buzz of fluorescent lights. When an officer called her name, there was no answer. When they stepped closer, everything, the chatter, the footsteps, the noise of Rikers Island, seemed to stop. Within minutes, the alarms sounded across the floor. Medical staff rushed in. Radios crackled with coded language, unresponsive inmate. Said unit. The incident would trigger one of the most controversial investigations in Rikers history. But at that moment, the people who worked there already knew something was terribly wrong. For years, Rikers Island had been the subject of lawsuits and federal oversight. It was a place where overcrowding met underfunding, where discipline often crossed the line into cruelty. Even its geography, an island cut off from the rest of the city, made it a perfect metaphor for the system it represented: detached, forgotten, and hard to reach. Layleen shouldn't have been there in the first place. Her bail had been set at just $500, but she couldn't afford it. Because of that, she spent weeks inside one of America's most dangerous jail complexes. When officers placed her in solitary, she had already been flagged by medical staff as someone who suffered from epilepsy. Her family would later ask how someone with a known medical condition could be locked away in isolation. After her death, the Department of Correction called it a medical episode. But what those words really meant would take months to uncover. Security footage from the unit would later show officers walking past her cell again and again, sometimes laughing, sometimes glancing through the window but never entering. For nearly an hour, Layleen received no help. The tragedy wasn't just about one moment, it was about a culture that had learned to ignore suffering until it was too late. To the other women in the unit, the silence from Layleen's cell wasn't just eerie, it was terrifying. They had heard her voice almost every day. She joked with them through the vents, sang softly at night, even called out to guards with a kind of defiant humor. Then, suddenly, nothing. Some inmates whispered that the officers didn't care because she was trans. Others said the staff was simply overworked, exhausted, and numb to pain. Both explanations fit the truth too well. Outside the jail, her family was unaware that anything had happened. Her sister Melania thought Layleen was still waiting for her next court date. She had no idea that her life had ended on an island less than 10 miles from her home. By the afternoon, word spread through Rikers. Officers spoke in low tones. The housing unit was sealed off. An investigation was announced before anyone had time to grieve. But even as internal memos circulated, questions began to multiply. Why was she in solitary? Why was she left alone for so long? Why wasn't her condition treated as an emergency? It wasn't the first time Rikers had been accused of neglect, but this case was different. Layleen's identity, a young transgender woman of color, forced the city to face something it had long avoided: the way vulnerable people are treated inside the system that claims to protect them. News of her death hit New York hard. Vigils formed outside the jail's main gate. Protesters held signs reading "Justice for Layleen." Her ballroom family gathered in the streets, dressed in glitter and black, chanting her name. She was no longer just another inmate, she was a symbol of everything broken within the city's justice system. Inside City Hall, the Department of Correction scrambled to control the narrative. Press releases spoke of ongoing reviews and medical incidents. Officials promised transparency, but behind the scenes, lawyers began preparing for lawsuits. The more the city tried to frame it as an isolated event, the more people began to see it as the symptom of a larger disease. By the time her autopsy was completed, rumors had already outpaced the official reports. Some said she had suffered a seizure alone in her cell. Others believed the staff's indifference turned a treatable crisis into a death sentence. Both accounts carried the same truth: she died while others looked away. As night fell on Rikers Island, the air grew still again. Guards walked their rounds. The sounds of clanging doors echoed through the hallways. In one cell, a radio still played quietly, a song that had no one left to hear it. The investigation was only beginning. The footage, the logs, the statements, all of it would be dissected in the weeks ahead. And with every new revelation, another piece of the truth would fall into place. But as the first reports left the island, a haunting question spread beyond the walls of Rikers. Was this tragedy an accident, or the inevitable result of a system that had stopped seeing its inmates as human? Because when they unlocked Layleen's cell that morning, nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. When the news of Layleen Polanco's death reached the outside world, it didn't arrive as a whisper, it hit like a thunderclap. Within days, headlines began to multiply: trans woman dies in Rikers solitary cell, family demands answers, city officials under fire. For many New Yorkers, it felt like déjà vu, another tragedy on Rikers Island, another statement from officials promising accountability. But this time, the story refused to fade. Behind the scenes, an army of investigators descended on the jail. The Department of Investigation, the Bronx District Attorney's Office, and federal monitors were all drawn in. Every agency wanted the same thing: to understand how a woman with a documented medical condition could die alone in a cell, while officers walked past her door. Inside the jail, the mood was tense. Officers were ordered not to speak to the press. Supervisors instructed staff to cooperate fully, but everyone knew what that meant: say as little as possible, and don't contradict the reports. The blue wall was already being built, brick by brick. When investigators pulled the surveillance footage, what they saw left them speechless. Over the course of nearly an hour, correctional officers passed by Layleen's cell several times. They peered through the window. Some even laughed. Not one of them opened the door until it was too late. The silence between those visits became the most damning evidence of all. By now, Layleen's family had hired lawyers. They held press conferences outside City Hall, holding framed pictures of her smiling in bright makeup and sequin dresses. She was more than an inmate, her sister Melania said through tears. She was a person. She was our family. As the investigation widened, it began to expose cracks in the system far beyond one incident. Records showed that Layleen had been flagged for medical supervision. Her file clearly stated she suffered from epilepsy. Yet no doctor had cleared her for solitary confinement. No mental health review had been completed. The paperwork had simply vanished into the maze of bureaucracy that defined Rikers Island. At first, the Department of Correction claimed it had followed protocol. But the deeper investigators dug, the more inconsistencies they found. Officers' reports didn't match the video timeline. Logbooks were incomplete. One supervisor admitted that rounds were often done by memory, not by the clock. In the hallways of the jail, staff whispered that some officers had grown careless. "You get numb to it," one said anonymously. "After years here, you stop reacting until it's too late." The city's medical examiner ruled Layleen's cause of death as natural, complications from epilepsy. But to her family and advocates, that word felt like an insult. There was nothing natural about being left alone for 45 minutes after your last breath. Civil rights lawyers compared her case to others across the country, inmates with mental illness or medical conditions dying in custody after being ignored. But Layleen's story carried something else: identity. She was a transgender woman of color, locked in a system that had never learned how to protect people like her. Within Rikers, trans detainees often faced unique danger from both inmates and staff. Many were placed in solitary confinement under the guise of protective custody, a decision that often led to isolation rather than safety. For Layleen, that isolation became fatal. Her death reignited a national debate over solitary confinement. Was it punishment, protection, or something closer to psychological torture? Activists called it a sentence within a sentence. For Layleen, it had become a coffin with fluorescent lights. City officials scrambled to contain the outrage. The mayor's office issued a statement expressing deep concern and promising reform. The correction commissioner announced an internal review. But behind every official phrase, ongoing investigation, policy adjustments, renewed oversight, there was a truth no one wanted to say aloud: Rikers Island was unfixable. Reporters uncovered more details. The officers assigned to her unit were part of a group known for disciplinary issues. One had been reprimanded for neglecting rounds before. Another had been caught falsifying logs in a previous case. Yet all were still on duty the day Layleen died. Inmates who had shared the unit described hearing laughter outside her door. They didn't take her seriously, one said. They said she was faking, that she just wanted attention. That single accusation, that she was faking, would haunt the case. Weeks later, the Department of Investigation released a preliminary report confirming what her family already knew: multiple officers had violated policy by failing to check on her properly. The city suspended 10 staff members. But for Layleen's loved ones, suspension wasn't justice. They wanted accountability. Her sister said it bluntly in front of the cameras: "They left my sister to die." Meanwhile, inside Rikers, the mood turned defensive. Officers claimed they were being made scapegoats for a broken system. "We're short-staffed, overworked, and blamed for everything," one guard told local news. "They act like we're monsters. But we're human too." It was a statement that summed up the moral confusion of Rikers Island, a place where empathy and apathy had blended into survival instinct. Outside the jail, protests grew louder. Members of the LGBTQ+ community marched through Manhattan with Layleen's name painted on signs. Drag performers led chants, turning grief into power. Her story was no longer confined to courtrooms or headlines; it had become a movement. When the city finally released the full surveillance footage months later, the reaction was explosive. The video showed the officers laughing just minutes before discovering her body. That laughter became the sound that defined the case. Under public pressure, prosecutors considered criminal charges against several officers. The evidence was undeniable, but proving intent inside such a bureaucratic maze was nearly impossible. The grand jury reviewed the footage, the reports, and the interviews. In the end, no one was indicted. The decision shattered Layleen's family. Outside the courthouse, her sister held a press conference surrounded by activists. "How do you watch someone die and walk away with nothing?" she asked. "If this can happen to my sister, it can happen to anyone." But behind the heartbreak, something was beginning to shift. Lawmakers proposed new bills limiting solitary confinement. City officials promised reforms to protect LGBTQ+ detainees. Rikers was now under stricter federal monitoring. For the first time in decades, people weren't just talking about reform, they were demanding it. Still, for those who had seen the footage, who had read the reports and heard the laughter, the question lingered: how many others had died unseen, unheard, and unremembered? Because as the investigation closed and the paperwork was filed away, one truth remained: Layleen's story was not an exception. It was a reflection. A reflection of a city that had built walls too high to hear the people crying behind them. And as the cameras turned away and Rikers returned to silence, the same question echoed through every cell: if the system could ignore her, who would be next? The year after Layleen Polanco's death, Rikers Island looked the same. The fences still stood high against the river wind. Buses still ferried new detainees across the narrow bridge each morning. And inside those walls, the silence felt heavier than ever. But outside, the world had changed. Layleen's name had become a rallying cry, written on protest banners, painted on murals, shouted through megaphones at marches that stretched from New York City to Washington, D.C. Her death had transformed from tragedy into movement. In 2020, the city settled a wrongful death lawsuit with Layleen's family for $5.9 million, one of the largest settlements in Rikers history. The mayor called it a reminder of the need for reform, but for her family, it was something else entirely, proof that the city had failed her. "No amount of money can replace my sister," Melania said quietly. "We didn't want a check. We wanted change." Behind the headlines, the federal monitors were still at work. Every few months, their reports reminded New Yorkers that Rikers remained in crisis. The jail was still overcrowded, understaffed, and plagued by neglect. New policies were announced, but old habits persisted. Officials promised to overhaul solitary confinement, to ban its use for vulnerable people like Layleen. They called it progress. But inside the system, reform was slower than the paperwork that described it. Still, something about Layleen's story refused to fade. Her name appeared in legislative hearings. Lawmakers quoted her case when pushing for the HALT Solitary Confinement Act, a bill to end prolonged isolation in New York State jails and prisons. When it finally passed in 2021, supporters dedicated it to Layleen and others who never made it home. It was bittersweet. Reform had come, but only after loss. Meanwhile, new footage from inside Rikers continued to emerge: more fights, more injuries, more evidence of a system buckling under its own weight. For many New Yorkers, the question was no longer how do we fix Rikers, but why does it still exist? The city's plan to close the island by 2027 gained momentum, but skeptics doubted the timeline. "You can shut down a place," one advocate said, "but you can't shut down a mindset." That mindset, one of indifference and dehumanization, was what killed Layleen as surely as her illness did. Her story had become a mirror for America's larger struggle with incarceration. A reflection of how poverty, gender, race, and bureaucracy can converge into tragedy. In the years following her death, community groups began holding annual vigils on Pride weekend. Hundreds gathered under candlelight, reading her name aloud. Former inmates spoke about their own time in solitary. Mothers of other lost detainees held hands and wept. It wasn't just grief, it was solidarity. Each year, the crowd grew. And with every new investigation, every report, every statistic, people returned to the same haunting image: a young woman, locked alone in a cell for a minor altercation, dying in silence while others walked past her door. Layleen Polanco had entered Rikers Island as a pretrial detainee who couldn't afford $500 bail. She left as a symbol of a nation's moral reckoning. In the aftermath, her ballroom family continued her legacy. They created scholarships, mentorship programs, and a foundation in her name. Her story appeared in documentaries, academic studies, and art exhibits. But for those who knew her, she was never just a headline, she was warmth, laughter, and light. Her case forced the public to confront a question that still hangs over every prison in America: what is the value of a human life when the system stops seeing it? Years later, federal monitors still report that Rikers remains unsafe. Oversight continues, lawsuits pile up, and the promise of closure feels both closer and impossibly far. But even through that darkness, Layleen's story endures, not as an ending, but as a warning. It warns of what happens when punishment replaces compassion, when procedure replaces humanity, when silence replaces justice. Because Rikers Island was never just a jail, it was a reflection of a system built to disappear people who didn't fit neatly into society's idea of worth. And in that reflection, the city finally saw itself. Layleen's life and death reminded New York, and the world, that reform is not just paperwork or policy, it's the courage to look into the mirror and change what's staring back. And even now, in the halls of Rikers where her voice once echoed, there are those who still remember her laugh, her kindness, her fire. She should have walked out of that jail alive. Instead, her story walks in her place, demanding to be heard. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.